not clear that he has a comprehensive understanding of how we should deal with, indeed, what the role of the WTO and the IMF even actually is, and what its aspirational goals have been. Because what Jeremy's put to us today is a few aims in terms of expanding minimum labour standards, in terms of standards on rights, global taxes. He's talking about global standards applied across the world. And fundamentally, this is something that the World Bank and the IMF is in principle in favour of. It's something that the IMF and the World Bank seeks to enforce around the world. But what the IMF and the World Bank currently do is they concede that in individual countries, in countries that are not currently at a position where they can properly apply these standards and receive practical benefit from them, what these global organisations do is give these countries the scope to make their own decisions. It gives countries scope to be flexible and indeed to make their own decisions about which companies they should invite in, what sort of standards they should negotiate with those companies. No, thank you. And what that means is that while Jeremy, and this is my first point of rebuttal, blended in together, while Jeremy wanted to talk about the idea of sovereignty in today's debate, essentially what the World Bank and IMF do at the moment is respect the sovereignty of individual countries to make their own choices. And they do not stymie development of countries based upon aspirational targets that Jeremy wants to talk about today, when really these targets they diminish the capacity of these sorts of countries to make their own decisions, such as have been made in Vietnam, Brazil and China, these kind of developing countries, ladies and gentlemen, countries that have proven themselves on the international market through initially having quite flexible standards and initially putting up with some bad conditions, ladies and gentlemen. What we see is that in the long term, Jeremy's approach is flawed. The second point of rebuttal, I've got one more after this, it's called Race to the Bottom. The second point of rebuttal I want to look at was openness to Western ideas. What Jeremy has said is that essentially there's a real hostility to Western ideas that develops in these countries on the basis that, well, they're imperialist and they're in it for themselves. I'm going to challenge the premise that these sorts of companies are essentially in it for themselves while they are driven by profit, ladies and gentlemen. That's fundamentally tied up with the rights and privileges of the people who they have working for them. But what I also want to challenge, ladies and gentlemen, is the idea that they create a hostility to Western ideas. Because firstly, fundamentally, when you're improving conditions in countries, when you're giving people access to employment, you're not generating hostility, ladies and gentlemen, you're generating goodwill. No, thank you. Moreover, when you've got greater exposure through the globalisation process to Western ideas and the kind of infrastructure that comes with these sorts of companies involves, the internet, and it involves, the media, and as such, you've got greater exposure to ideas about liberty and democracy. What you're doing is freeing up people's minds, and you're not making them hostile, but rather open to new ideas, and it's a positive effect in that way. Finally, and very briefly, on this idea of the race to the bottom, what I'm going to challenge in my speech is this idea that there is a race to the bottom, and that fundamentally the race to the bottom, at least to the extent that the opposition may argue exists, it has to stop at the point that the profits of companies are being impinged upon by the way that they're treating their employees. So I'm going to discuss today with you the ideas that the current situation, which we're at, what we're advocating, say, on the negative side of the house, is that we should extend the current situation and we should further encourage global companies to invest in smaller countries, in undeveloped countries, under their own standards and as understands that they themselves negotiate with particular countries, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm going to tell you is that has a positive effect in terms of markets, and my second speaker, Dom, is going to talk about how that has a positive impact in terms of ideas and in terms of liberalisation in these kinds of countries. I'm going to look at 3 points. Firstly, how it creates incentives to governments to improve. Secondly, how it ensures that people have job opportunities, no thank you. And finally, how it ensures that countries have revenue. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, what investment on a flexible basis from government organisations, from companies in these undeveloped countries provides incentives for governments to themselves improve standards, but also to initially get that initial investment, because what the opposition hasn't realised is that it's difficult for third world countries to appeal to large non-government companies. I'll take you in a moment. It's difficult for them to make that sort of appeal if they are stuck with the kind of flat rate standards that the opposition is advocating today. Yes.
Wouldn't you agree that in completely unbridled foreign direct investment, the only standards that a country has the incentive to comply with are the lowest ones possible to attract investment through low labour costs, low labour standards and low environmental regulations.
Andrew, what the negative is going to put to you today consistently throughout our case is the idea that while initially it may be attractive to particular countries to encourage, to have low standards, and indeed they have low standards at the moment, many of them, while it may be attractive, for them to be like that at the moment, inevitably in the long term, standards must improve.
On that point, Henry.
No, thank you. Because inevitably in the long term, this is what I'm going to talk about in my second point, companies have an interest in the people they're looking after, and companies have an interest in generating infrastructure and wealth and development in a particular country. No, thank you. So what I was telling you, ladies and gentlemen, is that there's an incentive to government to ensure that they are rational and stable. No, I was telling you something different. But what I'm now telling you, ladies and gentlemen, is that there's an incentive to countries to be rational and stable as well. Because what we have to realise is that big companies don't just come over into unstable countries. They're very selective about the countries they go into. So they're not just going to invest, and we haven't seen investment from large companies in countries that are completely screwed over, in the Somalias, ladies and gentlemen, because that's not conducive to profits at all. So we can see that there is an incentive there. Moreover, there's an incentive to be democratic and to respect rights. And what I'm going to talk to you about now is my second point, job opportunities for the people within these individual countries. Fundamentally, what we're giving people in countries through allowing initial investment on flexible grounds, which can't happen if it's put on this bare rate standard that the opposition is advocating today. What we allow for is opportunities in terms of jobs for the people of these countries. What we allow for, ladies and gentlemen, is choice in terms of where they are employed, and indeed, while the opposition has issues with the fact that people have no unions and what have you, increasing employment, increasing different opportunities for employment is essentially a union in itself, ladies and gentlemen, because it means you can move on from one job to another and you're not stuck in the kind of industries that people are currently stuck in, ladies and gentlemen. You have more flexibility in terms of where you yourself can be employed. Moreover, what it means, ladies and gentlemen, is that people have better living conditions for themselves and for their families, because companies fundamentally are held back when their workers aren't looked after, ladies and gentlemen. And that's been the basic reason for large companies like Panasonic and Sony for increasing their standards in Mexico, ladies and gentlemen, because they've realised that standards in Mexico have been so low that essentially there's not good morale amongst workers, and they're not having the opportunities to look after their families such that they can focus on their work entirely. What we're saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that large companies, which can only get into these sorts of countries if they are allowed to have flexible standards from the outset, ultimately generate better standards for the people in the long term, ladies and gentlemen. The final point I want to talk to you about was revenue for countries. It's self-explanatory, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking about taxation for countries. We're talking about companies bringing an initial investment and contributing to a country's GDP. Daniel understands. What I've brought to you today, ladies and gentlemen, is that you need to be flexible in your approach to countries in order